The calculated, heavy pause in the middle of an ordinary sentence serves as the invisible curtain rising upon the internal stage of our collective performance. We stand in the center of the room, intentionally dropping our vocal pitch into a low, synthetic rasp, drawing out our vowels with a slow, manufactured solemnity that we have carefully hollowed out to mimic the absolute quietude of an awakened sage. The fragrance of burning sandalwood rolls through the air in dense blue ribbons, a fragrant smokescreen meant to mask the cold, anxious sweat gathering along the tight skin of our shoulder blades. We hold our neck and torso in a rigid, performative stillness, a frozen posture that projects the immaculate composure of a stone deity resting in an ancient temple garden. Every movement of our hands is executed with an artificial slowness, a deliberate, stylized deceleration designed to signal to everyone around us that we are no longer troubled by the ordinary, chaotic currents of human emotion. We have become exquisite collectors of spiritual mannerisms, walking through our lives with a borrowed weight, our words carrying the carefully measured gravity of a master we have studied from afar, completely blind to the truth that this grand solemnity is a brilliant, desperate camouflage designed to hide a profound, trembling sense of our own personal insignificance. We have turned the language and posture of enlightenment into a high-security hiding place from the raw, unvetted friction of our actual capacity. When we sit in our circles, when we speak to our clients, or when we interact with our peers, we do not allow our genuine, spontaneous baseline to show its face. We filter our presence through a complex network of copied inflections, holy pauses, and detached, serene glances that we have stolen from our spiritual teachers and recognized mentors. We tell ourselves that we are embodying the lineage, that we are practicing noble presence, or that our forced, heavy cadence is a sign of deep structural alignment with the ground. We wear our borrowed gravity like a heavy velvet cloak, using the majestic cadence of an idealized archetype to buy protection from the terrifying, liberating reality of our ordinary, unpolished humanity. We are using our extensive library of copied gestures to construct an artificial plateau of authority, ensuring that our true, trembling animal voice never has to stand exposed in its own native skin, trading the wild, unpredictable current of a live throat for the safe, dead symmetry of an echoed posture. Let us bring our full, non-conceptual awareness to the image of the lead-weighted plummet line, the ancient primeval monument that stands as a silent map of our performative petrification. The lead-weighted plummet line is a thick, coarse hempen surveying cord designed to be used by master builders to measure the absolute vertical alignment of a stone wall against the deep gravity of the earth. In its natural state, the cord is completely flexible, its fibers responsive to the wind, its heavy lead plummet hanging free at the tip to register the truest, most organic line of the planet's center, allowing the mason to adjust their bricks according to the real landscape. But during a moment of profound internal panic, when the builder realized that the foundation wall was crooked, uneven, and thoroughly ordinary, they panicked and dropped the heavy metal weight directly into a bucket of wet chemical mortar at the base of the construction site. The dense paste flooded the lead, cooling and hardening into a solid, immovable block of dry concrete that permanently fused the plummet line into a single arbitrary angle. The hempen rope remains visible, its upper lengths still carrying the appearance of a tool of truth, yet the instrument is completely dead. When the wind blows, when the ground shifts, and when the masonry requires a new live measurement, the plummet cannot swing an inch. Its root is choked by a calcified mass of old stone, rendering its capacity to register gravity completely useless, turning a living tool of immediate alignment into a rigid, deceptive anchor that guarantees the whole structure will collapse because it refuses to yield to the changing soil. The alternative to this calcified anchor is the absolute inhabitation, of the thawing of the deep larynx and end state that completely bypasses the intellectual gatekeeper. The thawing of the deep larynx is a baseline somatic presence, where the artificial weights, copied frequencies, and stylized restrictions of our vocal apparatus soften into a resilient, highly receptive channel that allows the current moment to sound itself effortlessly without our mental correction. In this state of liberation, our system does not wait for the permission of our intellectual quality control department to deliver a word. We open our mouth with a heavy geological hospitality, letting our speech carry the warm, mineral-rich, and unfiltered vibration of our gut rather than the sterile logic of our strategic intellect. The voice drops down beneath the line of our social reputation, sinking deep into the wet loam of our lungs and the dark furnace of our lower pelvis. When we speak from this raw coordinate, we do not use artificial delays to manufacture a feeling of profundity, nor do we force our pitch into a safe synthetic register to sound enlightened. We allow our tone to be exactly what it is: rough, wild, high-pitched with temporary nervousness, or cracked wide open by a sudden wave of genuine grief, discovering that the open air does not require a copied master to validate our note, but welcomes the authentic mass of our own unique, unvetted medicine. We are a generation of stylized echoes resting on the shelf, praising our serene composure while our internal throat is welded into immobility by the dried mortar of imitation. We feel the terrible biological cost of this vocal imposture within the deep fascia of our mammalian frame. An isometric distortion where our terror of insignificance is cast into the alignment of our throat and our tongue joints. When we live our lives in a state of permanent imitation, our body locks itself into a defensive holding pattern, a physical grip designed to suppress any spontaneous upsurge that could reveal our hidden smallness. Observe the hyoid muscles, the root of the tongue, and the deep tissues surrounding the thyroid cartilage. In a human being who has surrendered the luxury of the borrowed weight, the throat is an open, floating canyon, its tissues moving easily with the shifting weight of the breath, acting as a soft, conductive pathway that allows the raw emotions of the belly to travel outward into sound. But in the body of the monastic mimic, the root of the tongue is held under a continuous industrial strength compression. We are pulling the tongue backward and downward into the throat, a hidden, frantic clench designed to force our pitch into that low, gravelly resonance that sounds so comforting, so deep, and so completely counterfeit to the ear of the spirit. This structural vigilance moves upward to cast an iron vice around our cranial base and our cervical ring, creating the physiological signature of the copied weight. The micromuscles at the front of the neck, the scalenes, and the sternocleidomastoid muscle are held under a continuous state of isometric contraction to force the chin slightly downward and inward, a physical posture stolen from the icons of ancient meditators. When a sudden, spontaneous emotion or a piece of relational friction arises that threatens to shatter our poise, it hits this muscular wall and is instantly strangled. We harden our neck, we freeze our head, and we hold our throat in a tight public relations clamp, ensuring that our vocal output is mechanically filtered through a dense layer of physical resistance that strips our speech of its raw mammalian empathy. This lock acts as a mechanical filter, ensuring that when we do sound our note, it arrives only as a slow, curated token of spiritual poise that cannot compromise our sacred image. The tissues surrounding the larynx harden into stone plates. The vocal folds are squeezed together into an artificial thickness, and the entire expressive apparatus lives in a state of permanent ideological lockdown, ensuring that we never emit a sound that could reveal our own ordinary, unintegrated confusion. Watch the thoracic ring and the deep chambers of our lower pelvis to see the ultimate victory of the borrowed gravity over our biological conductivity. The The thoracic spine and the ribs of the stylized echo are frozen in an unyielding stone shield, an internal barrier that prevents deep chest expansion. We do not allow our breath to widen our back. We do not let our inhalation touch the sides of our ribs. We maintain a high-engineered suspension of the lungs, a shallow, controlled breathing pattern that prevents any sudden, spontaneous cracks or bursts of genuine laughter from escaping our lips. This thoracic freeze ensures that our consciousness remains trapped in the high control tower of our analytical intellect, completely cut off from the instinctual, ground-level intelligence of our lower belly. Simultaneously, our lower pelvis, our sex, and our pelvic floor are held in a state of profound somatic hollowness. While we project a heavy, grounded authority through our slow speech and stylized movements, our actual root is completely disengaged from the floorboards. We are floating on top of our legs like an empty coat hanger, our lower back muscles locked to keep our pelvis from shifting, our true individual weight completely abandoned, because we are too terrified to inhabit the dark, unvetted void of our own unsigned flesh. We must find the discipline to demolish the elegant, spiritualized arguments we use to justify this lifestyle of permanent performance. The ego has discovered that the role of the copied master is the ultimate hiding place from the undignified necessity of being a live, unprotected human being. As long as we stay behind the shield of our borrowed gravity, we can preserve the illusion of our own advanced evolution. A copied inflection never fails a conversation. An imitated pause never reveals a hidden loneliness. A voice that remains inside a lead-weighted plummet line never has to face the embarrassment of its own ordinary limitations. By remaining the stylized echo who speaks with the slow, detached rhythm of an enlightened icon, we protect our pride from the messy necessity of being real. We can look down at the vulgar, uninspired crowds who are speaking at their natural tempo, laughing too loudly, and using ordinary words, completely blind to the truth that those uncurated actors are tasting the raw, mineral-rich nourishment of authentic presence, while we are turning into calcified mummies inside the pristine conservatory of our own copied holiness. The moment we leave the fortress of our imitation, or allow our borrowed gravity to be violently shattered by reality, the moment we force our throat to emit a sound without a single master's manual to guarantee our safety, the illusion of our spiritual integration is incinerated instantly. The cold, unsanitized wind of an unscripted confrontation strikes our bare throat like a tidal wave. Our unedited vulnerability drags our consciousness out of the conceptual sanctuary and plunges our system down into the crude density of the current moment. This is the first arrow, the raw, unfiltered upsurge of our actual, current capacity rising from the belly and demanding immediate execution in the physical world. It is that sudden, high-pitched giggle of nervousness that breaks through our composure during a serious meeting. It is that sharp, emotional crack in the voice that occurs when someone hits our soft spot, or it is that simple, unprofound statement of basic human confusion that begs to be spoken without waiting for a spiritual philosophy to validate its depth. This first arrow is clean, it is objective, and it carries the heavy, honest weight of our terrestrial reality, offering us a rare opportunity to drop our lineage shields and inhabit the raw mass of our current capacity. But the invisible editor within us cannot tolerate the degradation of its immaculate reputation. The moment the raw impulse hits our larynx and threatens to sound a note that looks clumsy, childlike, or unaligned with our high spiritual taste, our internal investigator fires the second arrow, deploying our stylized editing software to execute the animal voice. The mind intercepts the raw, high-frequency impulse and filters it through our lead-weighted plummet line, clamping down on the larynx, forcing the pitch downward into our safe synthetic register and substituting our genuine, trembling voice with a slow, curated token of spiritual poise. The mind whispers, This high-pitched tone is vulgar. It shows that your system is completely unintegrated. You have not done enough throat chakra work to access your true master voice. You must silence this crack, hold your breath, and deliver a slow, detached verdict so you can maintain your position as an advanced practitioner. In that fraction of a second, the tongue root is yanked backward into its clamp. The cervical spine locks into its marble pillar. The chest skin turns to stone, and the live creative current is instantly frozen, strangled, and returned to the dead sanctuary of our imitation. We feel a clean, temporary surge of intellectual safety. As we return to our familiar role as the silent scholar, who is too deep to speak with an ordinary voice, completely blind to the truth that we are murdering our own soul to protect our position on the display shelf, choosing the dead peace of an unblemished echo over the heavy, magnificent resonance of a live, imperfect note that could actually break the mud. To trace this vocal imposture down from its physical cage into the raw, unsanitized corridors of our daily ambitions and relational patterns, we must systematically examine the specialized personas we construct to hide our terror of raw exposure. When we surrender our life force to the preservation of the borrowed gravity, we do not merely lower our pitch or elongate our vowels in isolation. We develop highly intricate, defensive psychological programs that convert our dread of being seen as empty into a noble, highly sophisticated quest for spiritual embodiment. We split into distinct behavioral archetypes, each designing an automated fortress to escape the blunt friction of the present, yet both suffering from the same systemic, somatic starvation as we use our advanced spiritual vocabulary to strangle our authentic presence before it can disturb our social safety. Consider first the figure who moves through the world as the monastic mimic. To encounter this individual in an ordinary modern setting, a corporate office, a family dinner, or a busy neighborhood marketplace, is to witness a human system that has converted the external aesthetic of a monastery into an absolute maximum security bunker. They are the chronic adopters of an otherworldly calm, clothing their interactions in a stylized simplicity, walking 3 paces slower than the rest of humanity, and purging their everyday vocabulary of any phrase that carries the rough, energetic texture of modern life. They no longer say they are stressed, angry, or confused. They speak exclusively of being in a period of intense integration, experiencing a realignment of their field, or bearing witness to an ancestral shift. They carry themselves as though they are permanently stepping across the threshold of a sacred temple, keeping their heads slightly bowed and their hands folded in a posture of continuous performative devotion. Yet, if you observe this monastic mimic, when the environment suddenly shifts and demands that they drop their liturgical veneer to reveal their own raw, uncurated animal nature, when an immediate crisis requires them to fight for their boundaries, voice a sharp, undignified boundary, or admit to a petty, irrational human jealousy, their entire physiology enters into a state of acute, catastrophic panic. Their tongue root yanks instantly back into its industrial strength compression. Their neck muscles lock until their throat turns into a rigid marble pillar, and their mind launches a furious, protective sequence of moral justifications. They tell the room that the atmosphere has become too dense, that the conversation is operating on a lower frequency, or that they must immediately retreat to their sanctuary to cleanse their energy from the unintegrated pollution of the group. The monastic mimic is utilizing the identity of the holy exile as a brilliant, unassailable alibi to avoid the undignified necessity of being a live, bleeding human being whose throat is capable of making a coarse, unvetted noise. They have established an internal criteria for pure speech that no ordinary human emotion can ever satisfy. By continuously positioning themselves as the one who is channeling a sacred template of behavior, they ensure that their actual core never has to face the cold, unedited verdict of an honest relationship collision. They worship abstract models of saintly composure because an icon never slips up, never stammers, and never exposes the trembling, childlike dependency of their untested skin. They spend their entire life force building a magnificent temple of copied stillness, standing at the altar as the immaculate priest, while the living animal of their own creative throat is slowly suffocating inside a locked holding cell in the basement. Contrast this with the second archetype that populates our rigid framework, the guru's mirror. This is the individual who does not necessarily retreat into monastic silence. They possess an insatiable desire to guide, to teach, and to deliver profound realizations to the room. They are the permanent facilitators of other people's processes, the eager conductors of impromptu circles, and the insatiable accumulators of advanced spiritual methodologies. They do not hide in quiet corners, they are out in the middle of the arena, offering profound reframes for their friends' struggles, delivering deep, lingering eye contact to absolute strangers, and punctuating every casual conversation with heavy, pregnant pauses and ancient hand gestures. But if you strip away the borrowed lineage, you look beneath the specific rhythmic cadence, the deep, forced chest size, and the detached, all-knowing gaze they have lifted directly from their favorite spiritual authority. You encounter an organism that is running from its own terrifying insignificance. The guru's mirror cannot speak from their own unvetted baseline because they are convinced that their ordinary human voice is completely hollow, vulgar, and devoid of medicine. They believe that to be heard, to be safe, and to be valued by the world, they must completely overwrite their native frequency with the vocal texture and behavioral posture of an authorized master. The moment an actual relationship approaches a state of real-world intimacy, the exact moment. A long-term friendship or a romantic partnership requires them to drop the teaching script and speak as a simple, frightened equal. The guru's mirror enters a state of profound threshold terror. If a partner attempts to invite them into a soft space where there is no teacher and no student, but only two ordinary individuals witnessing each other's confusion, the mimic feels a blind instinctual panic that if they drop their stylized gravity, they will be exposed as an empty fraud, completely obliterated or abandoned by the room. To prevent this exposure, they execute a systematic act of psychological containment. They turn the relationship into a therapeutic case study, analyzing their partner's feedback as an unintegrated trauma response. Or they deliver a slow, detached sermon on the nature of attachment to shut down the emotional confrontation. They use their borrowed authority as a high-security shield to murder the raw, human connection before anyone can see their hands, shake, or hear the natural, high-pitched frequency of their genuine fear. They tell themselves that they are holding a space of higher consciousness for the other person, when they are actually protecting the fragile, narcissistic illusion of their own unshakable spiritual maturity. They prefer to live as a lonely, magnificent echo of another man's awakening, dying in solitary perfection atop their teaching stage, rather than risk the blunt, honest reality of being an ordinary human being whose voice is sometimes clumsy, whose poise is sometimes broken, and whose throat has to learn the undignified art of staying in the mud when the spiritual script completely fails. To maintain these defensive citadels. Whether it is the stylized simplicity of the mimic or the clinical profundity of the mirror, our physical body must execute an uninterrupted, high-latent act of biological holding. The human frame cannot be deceived by our holy arguments or our lineage credentials. To keep an authentic live-wire animal voice from breaking into the open air requires an immense, continuous expenditure of structural force. When we choose to live our lives in the theater of our borrowed gravity, we freeze our physiology into a permanent state of muscular containment, casting a precise diagnostic tax throughout our deep core, to ensure that the warm, turbulent heat of our gut can never rise up to shatter our absolute composure. Let us map this physical tax downward through our somatic landscape, observing the hard, fibrous restriction that clamps around the hyoid muscles and the base of the jaw, the mechanical reality of the clamp of the artificial tone. In an open, porous human being who has dropped the imitation and agreed to touch the ground, the larynx floats freely within a soft, mobile throat, its pitch moving naturally like a bird in the wind, acting as a direct, unmediated translation of the current somatic environment. But in the body of the stylized echo, the muscles supporting the tongue and the jaw joints are held under a continuous, industrial strength compression. This clench pulls the root of the tongue backward and downward into the breathing column, creating an artificial restriction that forces our vocal tone into that low, gravelly, synthetic resonance that feels so deep to the audience. We are literally choking our own natural voice to manufacture an illusion of spiritual authority. This restriction ensures that whenever we speak to our environment, our vocal output is mechanically filtered through a dense layer of physical resistance, stripping our presence of its raw, instinctual tenderness and delivering our insights only as a flat, cold and safe spiritual currency. The skin over our front neck turns tight, pale, and dry. The circulation through the thyroid gland is starved, and our entire expressive gateway feels like an iron lock, petrified that if we let the tongue root go soft for even a single second, a sharp, uncurated laugh or a raw, high-pitched cry of loneliness will break through the dam and level our respectable authority to the ground. Move downward through the torso to witness the rigid, immobile thoracic ring, the structural refusal to let the upper back and chest yield to the atmospheric pressure. In a grounded master who has committed their life to the raw, unedited reality of the present, the 12 bones of the thoracic spine are a soft, spring-like channel, moving with an undulating fluid grace that allows the rib cage to expand in all directions, receiving the world's breath with total hospitality. But in the body of the guru's mirror, who is always holding an impeccable posture and never yielding to a live impact, the upper chest is frozen in a state of high performative suspension. We are holding our rib cage like an iron barrel, our shoulder blades pinned backward and downward to simulate a state of flawless, unshakable alignment. This clench is the physical translation of our vocal imposture. See, we are simultaneously trying to look open and bracing against any spontaneous upsurge of raw emotion that could ruin our performance. This continuous tension solidifies the intercostal muscles, creates a permanent tightness along the upper spine, and turns our breathing cycle into a shallow, highly controlled pant that cannot reach the lower organs, completely cut off from the spontaneous, responsive rhythm of our instinctual center. Move deeper to observe the tension that locks the scalenes and the sternocleidomastoid muscle as the physical vice that forces the chin downward into a perpetual simulation of noble contemplation. In an uninsulated human being who lives on the open ground, the head rests lightly on top of the atlas vertebra like a leaf on water, its position shifting effortlessly with the gaze and the breath. But in the body of the monastic mimic, these front neck muscles are held under a continuous state of isometric contraction. We force our chin slightly downward and inward, locking our gaze into a soft, detached focus that mimics the expressions of ancient stone deities. This physical holding pattern creates a permanent mechanical compression along the cervical discs, starves the back of the skull of its natural blood flow, and transforms our head movements into a slow computerized rotation that cannot respond to the sudden, chaotic inputs of a live environment. We are living entirely within this high-engineered helmet, our consciousness trapped in the dry, analytical altitude of our strategic intellect, while the massive primitive engines of our gut resonance, our wild grief, and our animal joy are locked away in a dark cellar, starved of oxygen, left to rot in the dark because we are too terrified of what would happen if we let that heavy, uncontrolled liquid rise up to melt our borrowed gravity with its raw human warmth. We find ourselves trapped in a state of chronic structural exhaustion, our system continuously burning its vital oil to maintain an illusion of spiritual weight that never arrives at the threshold of real peace. We spend our days analyzing the cadence of our speech, perfecting our long, pregnant pauses, reading the latest books on ancient monastic protocols, and reviewing our performance in our internal mirror hall. We use our high-grade spiritual vocabulary to pathologize the ordinary, spontaneous expressions of our loved ones, calling their natural speed a low vibrational distortion or an ungrounded lifestyle, completely blind to the truth that these sophisticated reframes are simply the latest layer of lacquer we are applying to our coffin. We are trying to cure an evolutionary failure of courage through an endless accumulation of copied gestures, running around the outer perimeter of our lead-weighted plummet line like a bright, calculating ghost, petrified of the realization that if we simply drop our roll, loosen our tongue root, and let our voice crack wide open in the middle of an ordinary conversation, the raw vibration will shatter our definitions, dissolve our authority, and force us to stand naked in the middle of our own imperfect life. Every holy pause we manufacture to avoid a real, spontaneous response is a nail we drive into our own casket. Every stylized movement we execute by authority from the room is a molecule of cement we pour into our own internal plummet weight. We look at the raw, uncertified human beings who are out in the streets speaking at their natural speed, laughing with their whole bellies, letting their voices rise and crack with unedited passion, and loving with a clumsy, unpolished intensity, and we look down at them from our high watchtower of spiritual integration, analyzing their vocal and behavioral flaws with a cool, clinical superiority. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the incense burns down to ash and the teaching circle has dispersed, we are forced to face the agonizing reality of our own self-inflicted exile. We know that those crude actors are warm, they are conductive, and they are being fed by the rich mineral currents of immediate human participation, while we are turning into cold, marble statues of pure righteousness, freezing to death inside the pristine conservatory of our own copied holiness, our internal throat welded into immobility, while the great wind of the cosmos roars through the open plains, begging for a single, undefended breath from our buried human core to break through this theater of imitated holiness and touch the unmapped terrain of a real human existence. We must subject our internal editing engine to an unyielding, razor-sharp surgical dissection. We must turn our diagnostic focus directly upon the precise threshold where a spontaneous expressive impulse is captured, codified, and executed by our internal quality control department, using a cold, somatic awareness to expose the exact psychological gears we use to maintain our vocal isolation in the deep lineages of human awakening. This critical friction is illuminated by understanding the divergence between the first arrow and the second arrow, a diagnostic lens that strips our performative ego of its spiritualized and therapeutic disguises. The first arrow is the sudden, unedited upsurge of our actual current capacity rising from the dark wilderness of the belly. It is the raw, unfiltered vibration of the present moment colliding with our physical vocal apparatus. It is that awkward, high-pitched giggle of pure nervousness that escapes our lips during a serious corporate meeting. It is that sharp emotional crack in the voice that occurs when someone hits our soft, undefended spot during a confrontation, or it is that simple, unprofound statement of basic human confusion that begs to be spoken without waiting for a spiritual philosophy to validate its depth. This first arrow is clean, it is objective, and it carries the heavy, honest weight of our terrestrial reality. When it strikes our frame, the biological animal registers a natural wave of somatic heat. The pulse quickens, the thyroid cartilage floats upward, and a deep, archaic pressure travels through our respiratory muscles, demanding that we open our mouth, loosen our tongue root, and receive the environmental friction with our native, unpolished tone. This is the natural weather of the thawing larynx. It is the necessary, wild impact that occurs when reality tries to break through the calcified concrete of our social training, offering us a rare, primordial opportunity to abandon our lead-weighted plummet line and sound an original note. But as monastic mimics and gurus' mirrors who have been conditioned to treat performative composure as our absolute safety net, we do not permit this initial collision to complete its natural trajectory through our tissue. The exact microsecond, the tip of the first arrow touches the skin of our expression. Our internal quality control department wakes up with a frantic, predatory ferocity, launching the second arrow from the high towers of our strategic intellect. The second arrow here is the immediate, lightning-fast deployment of our stylized editing software. We do not simply allow the raw vibration to sound itself in the room. We filter it through a complex maze of psychological categories, holy cadence templates, and behavioral scripts. The mind launches a rapid sequence of panicked internal commentary. This high-pitched tone is vulgar, and ungrounded. It reveals to the room that your system is completely unintegrated. You must immediately silence this emotional crack. Hold your breath. Force your pitch downward into your safe, gravelly register and substitute this raw impulse with a slow, curated token of spiritual poise to maintain your position as an advanced practitioner. This is the ultimate self-sabotage of the copied weight. The second arrow is an act of vocal and emotional execution disguised as a dedication to noble presence. The intellect does not initiate this frantic sorting flurry to help us create deeper intimacy. It deploys it to protect our fragile, narcissistic pride from the terrifying, liberating reality of our own ordinary boundaries. The internal investigator realizes that if we remain standing in the middle of the room, if we simply speak through our natural tempo and allow our voice to shake, stutter, or crack without an authorized spiritual lineage to validate our position, the illusion of our immaculate, superior authority will be utterly destroyed. To preserve its position as the unshaken guide, the mind uses the very language of mindfulness, energetic ground, and sacred holding to construct a maximum security stranglehold around our throat, convincing us that whispering with a synthetic, low-register calmness is an act of spiritual mastery, when it is actually a panicked, desperate flight from the dark, silent majesty of being a raw human being who is willing to sound awkward in the open air. We must observe this investigative deflection operating in the ordinary, unglamorous arenas of our daily life. Imagine sitting across from your partner or an associate in a quiet room, and they suddenly speak a sentence that cuts through your intellectual defense armor, triggering a wave of intense, visceral vulnerability that makes your chest collapse and your eyes flood with tears. This is the first arrow, the clean, neutral friction of the living tapestry, offering you a rare opportunity to drop your lineage shields and inhabit the raw density of your current capacity. A deeply rooted practitioner would meet this upsurge with a heavy geological hospitality, letting their tongue root loosen, letting the high-frequency vibration pass through their throat, treating the crack in their voice as a sacred conversation between their bones and the live environment. But the invisible editor within us cannot endure the degradation of its immaculate reputation. The moment the raw impact hits our larynx and reveals that we are tensed, terrified, or deeply lonely, our internal investigator fires the second arrow, converting the raw collision into an expressive emergency. The mind whispers, "If you speak with that trembling, high-pitched voice right now, they will know you are ungrounded. they will lose respect for your spiritual wisdom. You must execute a tactical pause, draw a deep chest breath, tilt your chin downward, and deliver a slow, detached reframe of the situation in a low, resonant tone to demonstrate your complete emotional mastery. In that fraction of a second, the tongue root is yanked backward into its industrial clamp. The cervical spine locks into its marble pillar. The chest skin turns to stone, and the live creative current is instantly frozen, strangled, and returned to the dead sanctuary of our imitation. We feel a clean, temporary surge of intellectual safety as we deliver our slow, measured lecture, completely blind to the truth that we are murdering our own soul to protect our position on the display shelf, choosing the safe sterility of an unblemished echo over the heavy, magnificent resonance of a live, imperfect note that could actually break the mud. To break this cycle of permanent performance, we must systematically demolish the central sanctuary upon which the rigid framework of the copied weight is built, the illusion of authorized presence. We live under the continuous ancestral delusion that if we can only perfectly mimic the outward container of an awakened being, master the exact vocal inflections of our gurus, or achieve an unbreakable state of serene composure, there will come a designated day when we will step onto the earth completely immune to insignificance, rejection, or emotional disruption. We believe that our endless self-correction is building a bridge to a phantom sanctuary, a pristine plateau where we can finally speak and be heard without risking our social status or revealing our hidden smallness. This is a tragic biological fallacy maintained by the distance we keep from our own ground. There is no authorized presence. The magnificent temple you are building, with your endless holy gestures and copied pauses, does not lead to a sanctuary. It leads to a cemetery for voices that were too terrified to be real. The more spiritual mannerisms you accumulate to protect yourself from looking ordinary, the more petrified you become of letting another human being hear your native baseline, because you know with absolute, bone-deep certainty that your pride has grown so heavy that a single vocal crack or an unprofound sentence will level your entire identity to the ground. Life demands that you let your lead-weighted plummet line be violently smashed into pieces by the blunt friction of public exposure. You must give up your position as the unshaken guide, let the calcified concrete of your spiritual reputation be torn away from your jaw, and agree to touch the crude, unsanitized bedrock of human participation as a completely ordinary, uncertified zero who is willing to speak at their natural speed, willing to be wrong, and willing to stammer 50 times before breakfast. Let us sink into the immense, crushing relief of this understanding for a long, unmanaged respiration cycle. The liberation of this perspective is like waking up from a lifelong nightmare where you have been standing in the middle of a massive, roaring exploration vessel, holding a thick hempen plummet line that you have spent 40 years cementing into a bucket of wet mortar, attempting to calculate the exact mathematical angle of your posture so that no wave will ever disturb your serenity. Your tongue root is screaming from the industrial strength compression. Your cervical spine is locked into an agonizing marble brace. Your chest skin is turned to a numb stone shield, yet you stand there frozen, terrified that if your voice shakes, if your pitch rises, or your cadence reveals that you are completely lost in the dark, your entire universe will collapse in judgment. To wake up is to realize that the borrowed gravity is a tombstone for your empathy. You throw the cement block into the sea. You open your mouth wide to the horizon, and you let the cold, salt air crash directly against your bare throat, letting the wind write its lines on your vocal folds, letting the current carry your true note into the deep, discovering that the open ocean does not judge your technical flaws. It welcomes your mass, merging your breath with the absolute, unsigned infinity of the tide that has no use for your courtroom. When this somatic intelligence awakens within our muscle fibers, Our relationship to our own vocal and behavioral defense mechanisms undergoes an absolute evolutionary reversal. When we feel the sudden, suffocating contraction of our expressive panic, an internal investigator has detected a potential flaw in our poisui, no longer interpret these symptoms as a sign that we need to execute a new tactical pause or lower our pitch to protect our frequency. We do not say, "My system is ungrounded right now, therefore I must force my chin downward and slow my tempo to regain my master presence." We say, "The monastic mimic is panicking. Right now, there is a high, rigid iron clamp locked across the root of my tongue. My neck muscles are arching into a frantic military posture to shield my throat from the room. My thoracic ring is turning into a deadened stone shield to prevent the warmth of this genuine emotion from melting my defenses. My mind is generating a dozen different spiritual justifications to avoid facing the raw, heavy sting of my own ordinary, unpolished skin. This is the exact sensation of the lead-weighted plummet line being dropped into a volcanic furnace, forcing the cold concrete to yield its grip on the original chord. Observe the absolute, unassailable sovereignty of this positioning. The first statement is a performative diagnosis that validates our slavery, transforming a passing threshold of vulnerability into an endless lifestyle of vocal isolation. The second statement is a highly accurate, non-conceptual description of a somatic transformation taking place within our own biology. The first response is written by the permanent editor, who treats their presence as an asset to be protected. The second response is spoken by the raw builder, who simply accepts the crude weight of the friction, drops the analytical software, and allows their tissue to turn porous, knowing that the expressive crack is not an obstacle to alignment, it is the alignment. This is the path of the thawing larynx, the total, unconditional willingness to sound your note while feeling completely unmapped, unauthorized, and behaviorally naked. It requires us to cultivate a fierce, primitive tolerance for our own expressive disorientation, refusing to use our spiritual mannerisms as a transaction to buy authority from the room. When you feel the sudden suffocating squeeze of your own ordinary imperfection, that flat, unesthetic realization that your voice is shaking, your words are failing, or your own heart is screaming with a desperate, childlike longing instead of running back to your mirrors to plan a defensive retreat, you must have the discipline to stay in the room without a script. Drop your attention out of your quality control department. Sink your awareness down beneath your rigid neck ring, into your soft jaw, your conductive chest skin, and your heavy lower pelvis, and say to the silence around you, with your raw, unedited presence, "Right now I have no template. My master voice is broken, my temple is empty, and I am completely lost." This is what freedom feels like to an undefended system. It is soft, it is vulnerable, it is entirely unprotected, and it is the only ground that can sound the truth. By doing this, you strip the borrowed gravity of its hypnotic authority. The romance of the absolute direction relies entirely on your avoidance of real participation. The illusion that you can achieve spiritual weight by accumulating tokens of structural perfection from a safe distance behind a watchtower. The moment you bring the raw, chaotic reality of your undefended throat out into the massive space of your relational existence, the moment you treat your cracks and your clumsy attempts with the same objective curiosity that an old riverbed treats a spring flood, the spell of the watchtower is broken. The expressive flaw is no longer a moral catastrophe that requires another year of vocal training. It is simply the heavy, honest texture of the terrestrial bedrock we have been called to inhabit. Our unpolished skin is no longer a barrier that keeps us from creating, it is the exact location where our true power begins. Let us realize that the modern obsession with vocal composure, pristine presence, and endless behavioral curation is a collective defense mechanism designed to protect us from the undignified necessity of being real. We are all participating in an institution of hyper-insulated hyper-analysis, pretending that we can achieve liberation by turning our communications into an endless series of performance modules and monitoring our cadence until we are completely immune to the terror of insignificance. We look at each other's pristine, highly curated posture, the slow hand movements, the majestic pauses, the immaculate vocal registers, and we think to ourselves, everyone else has arrived. Everyone else is safe and integrated. I am the only one who is drowning in an ungrounded, clumsy mess. But this is a grand institutionalized illusion. Behind every monastic mimic, behind every guru's mirror who refuses to leave the stage, there is an organism that is petrified of the raw impact. There is a soul that is starving for the heavy resonance of the thawing larynx. There is a throat that is dying from its own iron clamp. There is a heart that is locked in a living death, because it has never allowed itself to drop its guard, let the map tear, and strike its full heavy mass against the cold bronze of a live, uncurated human soul. When this truth pierces through our intellectual arrogance, the competitive isolation of our composure hunting dissolves, replaced by a deep primitive conductivity. We see that the cold, silent indifference of the material world and the chaotic confusion of our loved ones are not enemies to our spiritual development. They are our spiritual development. The unscripted collision, the public failure, and the exposure of our ordinary limitations are the very hammers that shatter the calcified concrete within our plummet weight, allowing our original line to swing with absolute sensitivity. How can we be angry with the relationship for providing the blunt friction we need to become real? How can we abandon the ground the exact moment the storm moves through the valley and the raw, anonymous participation becomes possible? The surgical edge of this practice does not cut to paralyze us. It cuts to activate our availability. It strips away the comfort of our spiritual credentials to reveal the immense, unassailable authority of our current, undefended presence. It invites us to stop treating our voice as a commercial asset, to be managed from the safety of a watchtower, and to become instead the open, porous slate that has agreed to bear the wild, unsigned markings of the immediate coordinate. It is a radical invitation to break the rules, to smash the stage, and to inhabit the simple, crude, and magnificent majesty of our own unfinished humanity, fully awake to the raw and unpredictable current of existence that is happening right here on the heavy, unedited ground. To transition from the high, suffocating theater of our borrowed gravity into the vast, undefended openness of the thawing larynx, we must subject our nervous system to a systematic, physical counter-training of attention. An organism that has been conditioned through decades of composure hunting, vocal molding, and chronic structural bracing cannot be liberated by philosophical agreement alone. The instinct to pull our tongue root into an industrial strength compression, freeze our thoracic ring, and run back to our stylized pauses when an expressive crisis strikes is an ancient, highly organized survival loop written into the very fascia of our mammalian biology. To dismantle its authority, we must enter into a precise daily laboratory of somatic, waiter, rigorous mind-body discipline that intentionally dissolves the analytical editing engine, melts the public relations lock of our hyoid muscles, and forces our bare awareness to inhabit the cold, fluid marrow of our lower pelvic coordinates and our unprotected throat skin. This training is not a method to achieve a more attractive or spiritually superior lifestyle. It is a heavy, weight-bearing exercise designed to build the biological capacity to stay in the room when the lineage scripts are taken away and your counterfeit currency crumbles into worthless dust. The foundational practice of this larynx thawing discipline begins at the vital choke point of our ideological vigilance, the release of the hypertight tongue root and the mobilization of the deep vocal joints. We dedicate the first 40 minutes of every morning to a physical sitting practice that completely violates the neat, immaculate geometry of a temple stage or a stylized hall. We place our body directly on a hard, low-floor surface, allowing our knees to widen out toward the walls and dropping the full weight of our sacrum into the boards without the artificial support of zaphus or orthopedic padding. We keep our mouth slightly open, letting the lower jaw hang loose, heavy, and completely uncurated, instantly yielding the internal clench that holds our face in a position of pleasant serenity or clinical superiority. Once the posture is anchored, we direct our microscopic focus to the delicate, shortened tissues at the root of the tongue, the thyroid cartilage, and the front of the cervical ring. In the ordinary state of the monastic mimic, these muscles are held in an invisible continuous state of downward and backward tension, forcing the pitch into a low synthetic rasp to project an illusion of profound realization to the world. We breathe our attention directly into the hollow beneath the chin, the very cave where the hyoid and genioglossus muscles are clamping down on the larynx. As we inhale, we do not let the lungs expand upward toward the neck. We force the breath to widen horizontally across the chest, pushing the shoulder blades apart like a wooden beam. On every exhalation, we let out a low, unvocalized drop of total somatic relief, letting the entire throat tissue sink downward like a heavy piece of wet loam. We feel the voice box drop into its natural, low-floating cradle, telling our mammalian system that it is safe to be rough, safe to be unmapped, and safe to sound our native tone without an authorized blueprint to buy protection from insignificance. Simultaneously, we direct our awareness into the deep thoracic spine and the tight fibrous bands of our upper chest ring. We recognize that the rigid rod of our borrowed gravity is cast into this region as a permanent state of expressive hesitation. While maintaining the heavy, relaxed tongue root, we begin to perform a slow, intentional widening of the ribcage, opening the upper chest wall completely toward the front room. We lengthen the back of the neck, pulling the chin slightly inward, but without any tension, until we feel the dry, intense friction of the scalenes and sternocleidomastoid muscles along the side of the throat. We track the deep heat that begins to radiate through the cervical joints as the mechanical pivot of our steel cables brace is forced to yield. We do not perform this movement with the clinical neatness of a therapeutic routine. We inhabit it as a raw, instinctual reclamation of our unwitnessed skin. We visualize the calcified mortar melting away from our plummet line, the blood flowing back into the vocal folds, and the lower throat that have been starved of genuine resonance by a lifetime of ideological performance. We let the head rest lightly on top of the atlas vertebra, holding the position for several deep breath cycles, letting our neck stay fluid and soft, forcing our consciousness down out of the high control room of our intellect and plunging it directly into the heavy mass of our root. With the expressive gateway activated, we enter the second phase of the protocol, the melting of the rigid thoracic shield and the drop of the awareness into the liquid field of raw pelvic resonance. The habit of the Guru's mirror is to hold the tissues over the sternum in a permanent, deadened suspension, pushing the diagnostic gaze forward and keeping the heart isolated from the chaotic impacts of human connection. To break this structural partition, we place our hands flat on our thighs, close our eyes, and bring our attention to the long, sensitive line of our front throat skin and upper chest. As we breathe in, we consciously resist the urge to inflate the front lungs or to project our stylized composure forward into the room. We force the inhalation to travel down the back of the spine, filling the space behind the heart and widening the upper torso like a canvas sheet catching a winter gale. The critical intervention occurs at the moment of exhalation. Instead of maintaining our rigid posture, we let the throat skin soften, broaden, and turn porous into the space before us, allowing the ribs to collapse inward with a heavy geological weight. We allow the collarbones to drop their defensive crane and settle their full mass into the ribcage. As the air leaves the lungs, we feel our awareness drop through the tight, frozen channel of the larynx, moving straight down into the deep, dark chambers of our lower belly, our intestines, and our pelvic floor. We force our attention to spread out into the very skin of our front torso, imagining that our front body is becoming as receptive as a pool of dark water, expanding into the rough, neutral density of the atmosphere around the house. We are training our organism to tolerate the sensation of sounding an unedited note in the live air. We are breaking through the internal suspension that has kept us floating as a permanent echo, letting our weight drop beneath the line of our moral and spiritual reputation, discovering that the ground does not require an advanced lineage script to hold our presence. As we stabilize this heavy, unarmored presence, we encounter the frantic, high-frequency panic of the performing mind, which will immediately begin to launch the second arrow to protest its loss of social safety. The internal investigator will scream that we are sounding ungrounded, that our tone is vulgar, or that we need to execute a tactical pause to regain our master presence. To manage this mental turbulence without choosing flight, we deploy the mind training protocol of the unsigned instrument. The habit of the hesitant creator of gestures is to immediately convert every raw expressive impulse into a static spiritual red flag, mistaking the act of evaluation for the act of living. We strip the mind of this transactional power. When a wave of expressive panic hits your system, perhaps an intense, cold contraction across the tongue root, or a sudden freeze along your throat skin that arises when you realize your voice is about to crack or shake in public, you intentionally freeze the analytical engine. You refuse to call the sensation an unintegrated block. You refuse to label it as an energetic leak. You refuse to package it into a beautiful clinical explanation for your followers. You sit completely still within your wide knees, your dropped jaw, and your soft throat, and you meet the sensation as a pure, non-conceptual bundle of terrestrial friction. You feel the raw thud of the heart, the cold squeeze of the temples, the heavy pressure in the lower pelvic coordinates, and you treat it with the same objective, unblinking curiosity that an old river stone treats the mountain river current. You do not try to fix it, you do not try to optimize it, and you do not run back to your mirrors to execute a refurbishment cycle. You let the void burn openly in the massive space of your bare presence, proving to your nervous system that you can experience the absolute maximum frequency of vocal disruption without needing to open an exit door or check your reflection in the manual of a guru. Let us practice this fierce, anonymous hospitality right now, allowing the internal watchtower to crumble within the iron vault of our physical immovability. This formal counter-training on the floor is our laboratory. But the true forge of the thawing larynx occurs when we step back into the high-friction environments of our professional partnerships and our daily intimacies. We do not leave our practice on the mat. We implement daily grounding anchor somatic interventions that we deploy. In the exact microsecond, our pride intersects with the chaotic temptation of the borrowed gravity. Imagine you are sitting across from a partner, a family member, or a client, and they suddenly speak a sentence that cuts through your intellectual defense armor, triggering a wave of intense, visceral vulnerability. You feel a sudden compulsive urge to stop the conversation, execute a long, stylized pause, tilt your chin downward into your contemplative posture, or deliver a slow, detached reframe in a low, resonant tone to demonstrate your complete emotional mastery. This is the precise threshold where the guru's mirror would normally launch the second arrow and convert their relationship into a permanent teaching stage. Instead of executing the performance sequence, you deploy the grounding anchor. You do not move your lips to deliver a sermon. You do not reference a spiritual rule. You do not look away from the raw human face before you. Internally, you drop your attention completely out of your judicial software and bury it in your soft tongue root, your wide, dropped collarbones, and your heavy lower pelvic floor. You let your lower jaw hang loose. Relax the thoracic ring backward into the support of your chair, and let the exhalation drop your center of gravity straight down into the floorboards. You find the exact physical coordinate of your expressive panic, that high-frequency flutter in the throat, that fierce urge to lock your neck and pull your shoulders backward, and you wrap it in a massive, lower abdominal breath. You say to yourself, with total unadorned weight, "The stage is broken, the script is over. I have no master voice. I am touching the ground." By executing this somatic anchor, you perform a radical act of existential rebellion. You do not try to make your isolation look professional. You do not try to artificially patch up your reputation or use your spiritual vocabulary to sound more integrated than you are. You simply agree to hold the raw, unedited reality of your current vocal capacity in the massive, unyielding bucket of your bare presence. Because you are refusing to pull the emergency lever or treat your throat as a commercial asset to be managed, your presence ceases to carry the thin, synthetic frequency of a permanent echo. It carries the heavy, authentic gravity of an ancient riverbed that has agreed to receive the storm. You can be hurt. You can be destabilized. You can be witnessed as completely ordinary and unprotected by the entire room, without needing to adjust your posture or register for another lineage training to protect your fragile purity. We must apply this same unyielding discipline to our daily expressive and creative endeavors, implementing a strict protocol of performative fasting. The next time you feel the sudden, compulsive urge to immediately slow tempo to sound more profound, utilize an exaggerated hand gesture to project energy, or withhold your words until you can deliver them with a flawless, monastic neatness. Pause before you speak. Ask yourself with a cold, unblinking clarity, am I choosing this cadence because it serves the true liberation of the conversation, or am I manufacturing an automated fortress? Am I refining this pause because the raw silence of my own unprotected humanity is currently demanding that I stand on the bedrock without credentials, and my pride is too terrified to face the vacuum? If you detect the frantic, high-frequency panic of the invisible mimic, have the courage to close the mental script and freeze your tongue. Sit with the empty, unprotected space that prompted the desire to hide behind a copied gravity. Feel the hunger of the ghost that wants to remain the immaculate icon for the room, and let that hunger burn itself out in the cold, silent chamber of your unmoving frame. By refusing to feed the internal editor, you force the scattered cargo of your intellect to drop beneath your diaphragm, converting the dry dust of your spiritual reputation into the dense, solid anvil of authentic human presence. This practice requires an internal discipline that is far more terrifying than the superficial alignment of modern spiritual curation. It is easy to remain the monastic mimic. It is easy to spend a lifetime managing your connections from behind a wide desk of copied gestures. It is easy to feel deep while sitting in a circle covered in tokens of lineage validation. It is infinitely more difficult to look at your own ordinary limitations, your own unvetted dependency, or your own desperate need to be real, and to say, I am not going back to the stage. I am going to stand right here in the middle of this chaotic encounter. I am going to let my spiritual reputation be completely smashed by my own human volume. I am going to stay until the cement dissolves. But this difficult exposure is the only path that leads to genuine coronation. Every time you allow yourself to remain in the raw vibration without running back to a holy cadence template, every time you choose to receive the world's chaos without translating it into an expressive emergency, every time you let your map be torn without trying to repair the frame, you are shattering the mirror hall of your own narcissistic perfectionism. You are proving to your nervous system that your survival does not depend on the immaculate curation of a spiritual presentation. You are learning that you can be unready, you can be lost, you can be thoroughly uncertified by the spiritual markets of the world, and the universe will still transmit its power. Through your soft throat and your grounded spine, you step out of the endless cycle of performance to become what you have always been meant to be. Not a lead-weighted plummet line waiting for safety in a bucket of wet mortar, but a massive open channel resting in the middle of the river, fully committed to the heavy, anonymous, and magnificent fire of immediate reality. When we have fully submitted our nervous system to this rigorous counter-training, the long-standing theatre of our borrowed gravity begins to dissolve from our muscle fibers, giving way to the quiet birth of the original resonance. We step into the room no longer carrying the exhausting necessity of acting as the guardian of our own spiritual reputation. The heavy, protective armor that once cast an iron lock across our throat and held our neck in a rigid, performative column begins to soften into a highly receptive, porous tissue. We find that we no longer need to look toward an idealized archetype or remember the vocal cadence of a recognized master to feel authorized to stand upon the earth. The desperate, ancestral delusion that we must remain an unblemished echo to be safe from our own insignificance is incinerated by the simple, raw heat of our unmediated participation. We drop our shields, we abandon our credentials, and we allow our system to settle completely into the heavy geological maturity of our own unsigned skin. In this new state of consciousness, the voice ceases to operate as a commercial asset, to be managed by the high control tower of our analytical intellect. It becomes a direct, fluid translation of the immediate somatic environment, dropping deep beneath the line of our social pride and sinking into the dark furnace of our lower pelvis. When we open our mouth to speak, the throat reveals itself not as a narrow choke point of ideological vigilance, but as a vast open canyon where the wind of the current moment can sound itself without our mental correction. We allow our tone to carry the warm, mineral-rich, and unfiltered vibration of our gut, completely indifferent to whether our expression conforms to the polished symmetry of a spiritual teaching script. If our voice cracks with an upsurge of genuine grief, if it shakes under the weight of an unscripted relational collision, or if it breaks into a raw, high-pitched laugh of uncurated joy, we do not deploy our editing software to execute the animal voice. We hold the vibration within the massive hospitality of our bare presence, discovering that the open air does not require an immaculate performance to validate our note, but welcomes the authentic mass of our own unique medicine. We feel the immense biological rebirth of this liberation echoing through every chamber of our mammalian frame. The industrial strength compression at the root of the tongue loosens its grip, allowing the thyroid cartilage to drop into its natural, low-floating cradle. The thoracic ring, which once stood as a deadened stone shield to isolate our heart, yields to the atmospheric pressure, letting the respiratory cycle flow like an undulating tide from our lips straight down into the pelvic floorboard. Our collarbones lose their defensive crane and settle their full mass into the ribcage, while our lower spine and sacroiliac joints regain their natural spring-like flexibility. We are no longer floating like an empty coat hanger atop our legs. We are rooted firmly into the density of the terrestrial bedrock, our entire biology fully awake to the immense, unmonitored joy of sounding its own raw, imperfect chord. We realize that the immaculate spiritual poise we spent decades copying was not a sign of advanced evolution, but a magnificent, self-inflicted prison cell that starved our body of its wild right to participate in the chaotic friction of the world. True liberation reveals itself not as the achievement of a flawless, unshakable composure, but as the total, unconditional dissolution of the one who was trying to sound enlightened. We stand on the open ground as completely ordinary, uncertified zeros, stripped of our holy masks and freed from the exhausting labor of our vocal imposture. The mirror hall of our narcissistic perfectionism has been smashed into dust by the blunt impact of our public exposure, leaving no distance between the witness and the dance. We look back at the pristine plateaus of our old imitation with a soft, clear empathy, recognizing that our frantic hunt for composure was simply the trembling child within us, trying to buy protection from the terrifying, magnificent vacuum of absolute choice. Now, the watchtower is empty, the stage is dark, and the lead-weighted plummet line has been cast forever into the deep sea, leaving us naked and available to receive the raw, anonymous movements of the cosmos. The voice box is clear, the jaw hangs loose, and the entire expressive channel is primed to translate the next immediate boundary, the next wild boundary, or the next unedited truth without a single master's manual to guarantee our safety in the room. If the immaculate blueprint of your borrowed holiness has finally failed to keep you safe from the blunt friction of your ordinary flesh, and your throat is no longer willing to die for the preservation of an echoed posture, what original uncurated sound is currently trembling at the root of your tongue, waiting for you to drop the script and let it shatter the silence of your pristine isolation?